Daraj wants me to just get started. We seem to be on schedule, so I guess I'll keep the trains running. So I want to thank everyone. I would thank Daraj and everyone here at Bowdoin and all the participants today. You come to these events and you're not sure how everything's going to fit together, and I think it's been a really great discussion today, weaving together all of the different perspectives that people have. And now I have the benefit of drawing on everyone's ideas. I can claim I thought of all these things ahead of time and just weave them into my presentation. So my presentation today is on, it's part theoretical and then part empirical, drawing on social media as technologies of accountability, particularly why social media as technologies of accountability might explain certain resistance to its use within organizations. So first, I want to give some context for one of the things that interests me when looking at social media. One of my broad research interests is just asking the question, what, if anything, is really new about social media and organizations? And so as an example, I wanted to bring up the fact that computer-supported cooperative work, collaborative technologies have been around since computer-mediated communication existed. So this is an example of what would fit all of the requirements that many people have for social media technology. This is a tool developed at IBM by, in part, Tom Erickson and Wendy Kellogg have done some work with this, called Babel, and those dots show conversations going on between participants there on the left. They talk in their studies about how people would update each other on their conferences and what they were doing in the workplace. And this idea of making other people in the organization more aware of what everyone else is doing is one of the more attractive aspects of social media in terms of knowledge sharing, and is something that people interested in computer-supported cooperative work or in knowledge sharing in general have been focused on for quite some time. And so then the question becomes, what, if anything, is new about social media? And we've had a lot of discussion today about that exact topic, that should we think of these things differently than we think of other technologies, of other forms of communication? And one of the issues is this one of definitions itself. So we saw this in the past two presentations, which is what necessarily qualifies something as social media. And we see that many people associate social media with the prototypical tools. So when you say social media, people automatically think of Facebook or Twitter, or they think of the social media tools that they use. Other approaches to definitions have looked to establish certain features that distinguish social media from other forms of technology. So feature-based definitions. I don't really have to sell people in the audience today, I think, on the approach that I favor in looking at social media, which is an affordances view, and particularly some work that I did with Paul Leonardi, went and reviewed the emerging literature on social media use in organizations, and looked at this question of not social media as a distinct set of features or these prototypical tools, but rather a suite of technologies that allowed people to communicate in ways that might have been difficult or impossible in other contexts. And so we established these four affordances: visibility, persistence, editability, and association, and then explored a number of different questions that these affordances might raise in terms of studying organizational communication and social media use. But I wanted to extend this affordances view. I think one of the things that we were short-sighted on, and we saw, I think, harkening back to this morning and what Matt and Nicole were talking about, which is kind of these different levels of affordances, that affordances occur when we think of the context of use beyond just the individual interacting with a single technology, particularly when you're talking about issues of organizations and collaborations. And so this idea that people look at affordances very often from an actor-oriented point of view or a representational point of view, single person interacting with a technology hoping to accomplish something. But that's not how we actually work. That's not how communication takes place in organizations. Instead, I want to broaden affordances to look at what technology actually does in organizations. So when you make something more visible, or when content is persistent, and you look at that from a performative view, then you can think of this as communication that individuals are accountable for. And so I draw on this concept of technologies of accountability that Lucy Suchman developed, which she defines as systems aimed at the inscription and documentation of actions to which parties are accountable, not only in the ethnomethodological sense of the term, but in the sense represented by the bookkeeper's ledger, the record of accounts paid, and those still outstanding. So, I was really glad to hear PJ and Nathan's view. They draw on phenomenology. Ethnomethodology is related to this idea of phenomenology, and this is the idea that meaning is derived through the actions that people take, and that we should study the process that actually takes place in the construction of meaning. And that's really what we do. That's what the Montreal School that we just heard about, they draw very extensively on ethnomethodology as well. And so when we look at how social media are technologies of accountability, we can look at this in two forms of accountability that Suchman's definition talks about. We can look at this as the bookkeeper's ledger, the actual physical accounting of what people do. It documents communication and makes it visible. So it makes it visible to others so that as Durish says, observable and reportable. So this is the explicit meaning of what people are saying, the actual content provided. But there's also the second aspect of it, this visibility that we talked about as well in terms of what people are doing, how they're communicating, to whom they're communicating with. And so it also has this symbolic meaning of what people say and how they're actually saying it. So the fact that somebody chooses to use social media as opposed to all of the other the suite of technologies they have available to them, that has meaning in and of itself as well, and that's a decision, an act that individuals are accountable to. So this led to my research question, which is how do perceptions of accountability influence workers' decisions to participate in an organizational social media system? And to do this, I looked at the implementation of a social media technology. It was a social networking tool that was being implemented in a financial services company in the Midwest. This is a global financial services company. They provide credit cards, student loans, the works. And we looked specifically at the actions of 16 members of a marketing division in the company. These were low-level employees who were relatively recent to the company, but were also engaged in a leadership program, so they were identified as high-potential employees who would rotate through different parts of the marketing department. This was 2 rounds of data collection, interviews, and so we interviewed them before the technology was implemented. They did not know that this technology was going to be implemented. We asked questions regarding perceptions of technology, technology use, a broad series of questions. And then in this interview, we asked about a hypothetical social media tool that would be potentially implemented in the organization. And would they use it? What types of uses might they see? What types of uses might they anticipate from other people? What value, if any, did they see from it? And really probed into just the perceptions of social media use in the organization at large. And then the second round of interviews was 5 months after the social media tool had been implemented and they had been given use to that. And that occurred about 8 weeks after the first interview. This social media tool, if anyone's familiar with Jive software, they built the custom tool for the organization that was used here. There were other members of the organization who were participating who had access at this time, but not everybody did in the organization, and that'll be key later. There were a number of different features on this tool, which we'll call A-Life. They had personal profiles, groups, discussion boards. They could establish connections with other employees. They could subscribe to the content so that they'd get an email when certain things happened, and could be alerted of changes on the site itself. So we went through, or I went through rather, and coded 4 different themes regarding their opinions of social media, both based on the first interviews and then again based on the use, the comments on use afterwards. So first I want to show you how they use the actual tool. There's a lot of no's here and not a lot of yeses here, and it's a busy thing, but I think the most important thing is just flat out they did not use the site very much. Particularly people used the site very early after launch. They were encouraged to experiment to see what it was all about, but only 3 people were consistently active on the site after its first months of use. So if you recall, we looked at 5 months of use, and after the first month, there was widespread recognition of use. So despite the fact that managers implemented this to kind of increase communication and knowledge sharing and collaboration, the system was not widely adopted, very limited use. And so then the question is, why did this happen? And so in looking at the anticipated value of the social media from the early interviews and then the actual comments afterwards, 3 themes emerged related to this idea of accountability. And this was reflected both in their perceptions of the social media before implementation. So the employees told us as the interviewers, despite the fact that managers were going to go ahead anyway, they said, well, we don't really think we're going to use this. We don't really see the value in this. And they said because of these 3 things, and I'll get into each of these. And I want to share some of the data from after the use of the social media for the sake of time. It's the more colorful material, but I can talk about kind of the earlier perceptions as well. But they corresponded, and that's what was a really interesting thing. They said they weren't going to use it. It was implemented. They didn't use it, despite the fact that managers were incredibly optimistic about its potential. So the first idea was this accountability as a professional. These were younger employees early in their careers, and they were very cognizant of the fact that they were in a workplace, that they were being judged based upon how they performed in their particular job roles, that they had managers, that they had supervisors, that they were going to rotate around to these different positions. And so they wanted their communication to reflect how a professional would communicate. So Vicky mentioned that there was negative pressures to not post on A-Life. The idea was she was afraid if she posted on A-Life, her boss was going to think that she didn't have enough work to do. And that's the feedback that she had heard from other people as well. Now remember, as we talked about an enterprise social networking tool, this is only internal. So it's not like she was on Facebook or Twitter communicating to people outside the company. So communication on A-Life is still with her fellow employees. Leo made the comment, kind of echoing this, that he remembered Joey was posting on everything. They launched it. He would start message boards and book ideas and who wants to play basketball after work, but then also business-related stuff, where to find this document, and he was the most prolific poster. And Leo made the very simple comment, I remember thinking, is he even working? Is he even doing anything? And so there's this idea that participation in the organizational social media was not viewed by these employees as a professional activity. New employees were acutely aware of the perceptions that were associated with social media use. So that's in their job role. But they also felt accountability to an unknown audience. And so you see this quote from Deborah, I don't want people to see my conversations. I don't know who's on this system. I don't know who's on A-Life. And I don't want to sound dumb because this is a professional environment. And it's not like email where I'm taking the time to write it, so it's a strange balance. And this comparison to email is very important when we talk about affordances, because email, it only goes, at least unless somebody forwards it on, it only goes to the person I put on the to, the CC, and the BCC line. But with social media, you're not really sure who's on the other end. You're not really sure, unless they comment directly or give feedback, who's actually viewing the material. And Brad says this kind of in a more crass way, which is, it's not that he doesn't want to share with people, but he doesn't want people to have the opportunity to misinterpret what he's doing or what he's done. He said, I'm way more confident in my ability to form accurate impressions of other people than I am for them to form accurate impressions on me. And so there's this idea that by putting communication out there in this environment where they were unsure of the audience, that it left them open to being judged in ways that they didn't want to be judged. The last form of accountability, just repeating that. Also, this last point related to that, which is we've talked a lot about kind of this issue of control and the choices that people made. And people saw a very clear relationship between the acceptance of accountability and the perceived control of individual communication. So the choice to use the social media was a choice that individuals made. They didn't have to, and so by communicating in that realm, they were explicitly accepting accountability for what they communicated. And in most cases, this was an accountability that they did not want to be called on. And so the last one is the accountability to the organizational role. So they had certain work that needed to get done in the course of their different jobs. And as Sarah said, I haven't talked to anyone on my team about A-Life. Outside of the leadership program, who are the other people on the social platform, it's never come up whatsoever. I take that as a sign that they don't need to engage with me on it. And so people were much more focused on the communication technologies that everybody was using, that they were going to be sent task requests for, that they needed to use to get work done. And A-Life was positioned as something additional to that. So you communicate with your coworkers, your team, but they're not necessarily on A-Life. So any communication that you did that was outside of your organizational role. And it was much more important to be accountable to your team members, to your task communication, than it was necessarily to communicate on A-Life. And Leah mentioned this idea that A-Life was much more of a networking thing. You wouldn't find it in your immediate job. Anything pertaining to my job and task at hand, I wouldn't go to A-Life. So this is just reinforcing the fact that A-Life was viewed as something that was outside of the normal course of work. And as we've talked a lot about today, the plethora of different communication tools that individuals have available to them. And the idea is that A-Life was one, we heard this from multiple people, that it's just another thing that I have to check on. It's another thing that I have to be responsible for. We don't need more communication tools. And so the respondents said that social media activity was viewed as separate from task-oriented communication. It was unclear how social media use would fit within the already crowded space of organizational communication technologies. So what can we conclude from this? Why is this kind of case study of resistance to social media important for how we're theorizing about social media and organizational communication? Well, I think there are a few things going on. One is that workers were very aware of the accountability associated with communications via social media. So this is the importance of context when we're talking about different affordances. Particularly visibility was very important to them. So when we think about social media use outside of organizations, we often think of it as incredibly empowering. It has this broadcast, this expressive nature, that individuals can reach large amounts of people. And so this idea that we can send something out there for people to see is very empowering. It's very attractive. But in an organizational environment, that can raise anxiety. This idea that I don't really know who's out there confronting my communication. I have a very clear idea of the potential audience, which includes my bosses, my managers, other coworkers, but I don't know who's exactly doing that. And so that raises the anxiety. And because of that uncertainty, the popular choice was to just not engage with the media itself. And so this idea of context being incredibly important is something that we'll see again and again. Second thing is the idea of mediated performances as being increasingly central in organizations and a product of co-constructed communication. So if anyone's ever walked into an office, you'll see rows of cubicles, oftentimes, people just sitting steps away from each other, side by side even. But they're not talking out loud in most organizations. You're still IMing with the person 10 feet down in a different office. You're steps away and you're communicating over email. And more, this computer-mediated communication is the central way in which people communicate with others in the process of work. And so we make judgments about people based upon this mediated communication. It matters. And so we heard this, PJ and Nathan's point, that it's not virtual. We don't think less or more necessarily of communication over these technologies. But if I'm making evaluations about someone's identity, their knowledge, their expertise, their value to the organization, these performances matter in terms of these judgments. Third, individuals view organizational social media in different ways than non-organizational social media. So again, repeating this idea that context matters. One of the things that related to this last point as well, which one of the implications of this is that familiarity with social media outside of organizations may actually increase resistance to social media inside workplaces. So there's kind of this stereotypical idea that younger employees, particularly because they use these technologies so frequently outside of the organization, actually want them inside of the organization. And what we heard again and again is, well, this is sort of like Facebook for the company, but we already have Facebook. And so we heard that idea that these tools had a function and it wasn't for professional work environments. And one of the implications of this is that organizations may be better off not framing these technologies in the same vein that they do existing social media technologies. So not talking about a social networking site inside the organization as like Facebook, but talking about it more in terms of what you want the technology to do. So talk about it more in terms of a knowledge sharing technology, or talk about it more as a collaboration tool, and talk about it more in functions. And I think that's one of the really strong themes that came out of the discussion today, which is that social media has, when we talk about modern communication technologies in general, they're much more complex than we think of kind of earlier communication technologies. And this flexibility is very empowering, from a design standpoint, from a usage standpoint, but it poses a lot of challenges from a theoretical and analytical standpoint. And so I think, the word affordances got thrown out around a lot today, and I think that's a great discussion to have. But really what it is talking about is a more thorough examination of what technology does in organizations, not what technology is, because that's kind of an a priori assumption about a feature set that's already put together and doing something. And so asking more questions about what technology does in organizations, I think will get at the heart at kind of the meaning and contributions of these technologies. And asking that question, as we've discovered today, is not easy, because asking what something does requires you to ask hard questions about what's going on in a particular setting. The context, the attributes of the individuals, the features of the technology, all of these things matter in the process of what technology does. But I think, after today, I'm excited to continue this work, and excited to kind of hear what you guys have to think as well. So thank you.